Next we have Shaykh Abdallah Adhami speaking. Shaykh Abdallah Adhami was born in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., of the noble lineage of the family of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He began his studies of Sharia at the age of 8 and heard his first scholarly narrative in 1975. He earned scholarly licenses from many eminent scholars from Damascus, Egypt, and Morocco. As a certified narrator of hadith, he is honored with the highest doctoral credential in the interdisciplinary legal canon. Shaykh Abdullah also holds a degree in architecture from Pratt in New York City and has 7 years of international corporate experience in the area of organizational development and executive training. Shaykh Abdallah Adhami has been serving the needs of the Muslim community in North America for over 20 years. His postdoctoral works center on exploring the legal, ethical, and spiritual dimensions of the linguistic implications of Sharia texts. His works also strive to relate the eternal relevance of the essence of Sharia laws as a vehicle to enhance modern lived experience. He is the founder and chairman of Sakina. Please help me welcome Shaykh Abdallah Adhami.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وسلم تسليما كثيرا. الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا صلى الله عليه وسلم عبده ورسوله. I understand we're here to talk about sexuality in Islam. And I think that generally to begin by framing the question from the Quran and the Sunnah is very important, because it's obviously sexuality is but one dimension of our humanity. And it's useful to see how does the Quran and the Sunnah shape the human self-image holistically so that it's honest. The first problem, as both my co-panelists have highlighted, is the, if I can paraphrase you both, the lack of, or the need for more honesty. The Quran is so honest in this particular regard that its discourse, I would posit, would be challenging for even those who claim to be Muslim and claim to want a response. The very Quranic discourse, again, that people claim are yearning for, particularly the Muslims, are yearning for what the Quran and the Sunnah say about our sexuality as human beings, would find this discourse problematic and would question its tenets. And so that's number one. To begin by practical examples of what that's like, for example, the first thing we observe in the Prophet's manner, in the manner of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is to highlight to people the difference between intimacy and sexuality. So when a person is yearning for intimacy, this is something that is reflective of their spiritual essence. So literally the yearning to be intimate with another human being of the other gender is actually an acknowledgement of one's spiritual essence, of one's soulfulness. And very often, unfortunately, what you have is in a culture that emphasizes the carnal and the physical and the material, that yearning for intimacy is mistaken for a desire for sex. It's, in other words, intimacy mistaken as sexual thirst can be a problem. So to begin with, number two, the Quran cannot prepare you to speak about sexuality unless it first addresses your human essence progressively, because ultimately sexuality requires, to engage in the sexual act, there's a prerequisite which is the ability to be vulnerable, the ability to express and to accept and to acknowledge frailty and vulnerability. When, again, I keep oscillating between the ideal in the Quran and the Sunnah and the cultural reality, including ours here in a Western paradigm. So to do this within a libertine, secular, humanist ethos is problematic, because the overwhelming emphasis in a material and carnal culture is on individualism. And the individual emphasis, the emphasis on individualism, the emphasis on the self, the emphasis on fulfilling oneself without much regard to responsibility, represents truly the biggest, arguably, obstacle to a fulfilling sexual experience. Because sexuality in its essence, or at least in its Quranic essence, is a readiness to be vulnerable, an acknowledgement of frailty, and one of the highest manifestations of the metaphysical polarity of the genders. So this honesty about, so again, another level, going a step further. Though the Quran acknowledges there is metaphysical polarity, لَيْسَ الذَّكَرُ كَالْأُنْثَى, as in the 3rd chapter of the Quran, the Blessed Family of Mary, Ali Imran, when the Quran declares that the female is not like the male, without the exegetical differences of whether Hannah, the mother of Mary, said that or God said that, is not really the point here. But the golden word in that chapter is how the Lord of the worlds announced to the mother of Mary, فَتَقَبَّلَهَا رَبُّهَا بِقَبْولٍ حَسَنٍ. Her Lord accepted her. Her Lord accepted her. The acceptance of Mary represents a shattering of a cultural and theological paradigm that a woman is not fit for the service of the Lord. So her Lord, and hence the sadness of Mary's mother that she is bearing a female, and she has put forth a female, is immediately embraced by the Lord of the worlds, announcing a new paradigm that this female is going to be accepted, and not only accepted, but is going to be raised to be the ultimate model of righteousness and virtue for all time to come, and she is female. So again, while there is an acknowledgement of metaphysical polarity, that the male is not like the female, the Lord of the worlds will do things that are utterly incomprehensible in the physical sphere to raise the female in certain instances, and to raise the male in certain instances, and to say to both, and do not covet of God's bounty what each of you had been endowed with in the chapter of Nisa, the 4th chapter of women. وَلَا تَتَمَنَّوْا مَا فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ بِهِ بَعْضَكُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. Do not covet what God had favored some of you over the other. So this favoritism, or seeming favoritism, is actually a realm to enforce and to celebrate this mutually interdependent and complementary polarity that is necessary for the existence of life. The pretense to equality within a secular system, the obliteration of difference, actually constantly ends up hurting the, let's say, the minority within the social sphere. So in this particular discussion, when there is an obliteration of difference and an overemphasis on equality, the women and the children and the other minorities are going to be hurt from this discourse, because there is a pretense of equality. The Quran is honest about the physical inequality, and that God has favored some over others for certain functions, for certain responsibilities, for certain duties, and that the mutuality between the two and the complementary assistance that they owe one another and the responsibility that they cherish in one another is ultimately what would make society whole. And ultimately, at the very end of this endeavor, sexuality would be more fulfilling. We're trying to address sexuality from the very beginning. We're doing it backwards. This is the reason we have so much heartache in society. Because before people are ready to assume responsibility, before people are vanguards of virtue in their private life, there is too much egotism, there's too much delusion, there's too much selfishness in our cultures across the world, regardless of what our religions are or what our religious beliefs are. In order for us to, in other words, that egotism, that self-centered, that's obsession with self and obsession with image is actually an obstacle to our humanity before it is an obstacle towards our sexuality. The overemphasis on image and physical appearance within a secular construct, again, on another level, actually presents a further obstacle to an honest discussion about sexuality. Because when you have an overemphasis on physical appearance, notwithstanding how that's associated with a lot of pathological conditions, with illnesses, with anorexia, with eating disorders, and potentially suicide. That's a whole other discussion. But the overemphasis on the physicality and the image in culture emphasizes only the carnal and the material and the physical within our human makeup. And unfortunately for us, our physical reality, our material dimension is the most carnal, the most irrational, the most impulsive, and potentially the most insatiable as well. So a person can theoretically can never be sexually completely fulfilled unless they are spiritually fulfilled first. And I know this is a higher level discussion, but from the Quran and the Sunnah, we understand that the quote-unquote pleasure that comes from intimacy has a far more lasting physiological, literally physiological, and spiritual benefit than even the most profound orgasmic experience in the physical sphere. Because the intimacy is something that reclaims that higher celestial origin of the human being. Engaging in sex in the physical sphere only before being whole is only an attempt, and a feeble one at that, to only fulfill the most carnal in our hunger, the most irrational in our appetites and desires. And that is only one aspect of our humanity. The Quranic discourse on sexuality is seeking to bring us to a level of reality that, and this is a revolution in religious discourse, is trying to make us appreciate our sensual energy. Can you imagine a religious text actually acknowledging sensual energy, or erotic energy, or sexual energy, if you will, sexual, erotic, or sensual energy? How the Quran and the Sunnah, or how the Islamic discourse does this, is how I'll take the next part of the conversation specifically. The first acknowledgement of the sensual dimension in the human makeup, and this is again just to paraphrase what I said earlier to make a transition. It's very important for the Quranic discourse to present a holistic definition of the human being. So there is polarity between, and a complementary polarity between the male and the female. That polarity makes them interdependent. Everyone has their function and their role, and those roles are dynamic and malleable. The cultural obstacles to these roles is the stigma that is associated, which is actually another discussion. I'll try to address some of that towards the end of the presentation, otherwise it'll have to come up in the question period. But the cultural stigmas of what those role definitions are is an obstacle that was literally beyond the ability of the Prophet to fix. Beyond the ability of the Prophet of God to fix. The cultural dogma that governs gender and governs the roles of women and men and a woman's place. And I would add to what my co-panelist said, not only is this a problem in the physical issues, but it pervades literally everything, and especially about the female, of course. So before we worry about the place of a woman in a Muslim society, whether it's, you mentioned whatever two countries there were, it's really not important, without disregard to your examples, of course, but it really isn't important what two countries were mentioned, or 10 countries for that matter, because we have a human problem that is universal. The oppression of the female in terms of not only her sensual energy, the oppression of her sensual energy is just but one manifestation in a period, in a series of things. One of them happening to be her sensual energy. Everything about the female is oppressed, including in our Western societies. It's more subtle in Western society, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. And it would be incomplete to the discussion to pretend, and a travesty against women, to pretend that any example, whether it is theoretically the Islamic one or theoretically the Western one, is the best solution for humanity. And so I would like, in my own idealism, that every discussion of gender and sexuality and freedom and anything be a clarion call to a more humane discussion and an opportunity to admit our failings as a human race in being honest about these issues. So the Quran and the Sunnah, the Islamic discourse of how this sexual or sensual energy is acknowledged, and in the interest of time remaining, I'll skip the Arabic quotations and just synthesize for us. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, affirmed that the epitome or the signature quality that defines a Muslim is modesty. Not gender specific, but Muslim women and men. Modesty or haya is really not just modesty. Haya, the Arabic word, is literally a recognition of one's sensual energy. The recognition that one is a creative human being, a creative individual endowed with powerful sensual energy, and the recognition of that sensual energy, the recognition of erotic energy within that person actually is what provides or inspires their modesty. So it's totally the opposite from the cultural dogma. It's not that you have hayat because you're not supposed to engage in those shameful practices, supposedly. You have hayat, you have modesty built in you, particularly to build you for a more fulfilling sensual experience. Of course, we understand everything backwards, because everything is shameful, and everything is, yucky and improper, and especially from we're talking about from children. The nakedness of children, and here's the perversion. I'm so sorry to upset you with this. We stigmatize children from their own nakedness, but we have absolutely no problem, and I'm bunching so many people in we here that's terribly unfair. Inshallah, most of us in this room are innocent from it. But, when there are crimes against, sexual crime against children, it's covered. And it's not shameful. And it's not so horrible. And nobody goes to war over female mutilation of any physical part of the female. Nobody goes to war over it. Nobody raises hell over the female body being violated in a prepubescent phase. And they are relegated to hellish lives, constantly being controlled in their breath and in their gait before they even are allowed to speak. And this is something that I highlight to a lot of singers. Many of my sisters are wonderful rap artists. I know this because I love them and I trust them. I just never heard their voice because of all this social stigma that God forbid you hear a woman's voice. It would be the end of the world, apparently. The cosmic sphere would crumble as it exists. And God knows how, only God knows how His Majesty would feel about this. And I'm really not joking about this. it really is a major problem if our own daughters have and I remember one rap artist once told me, you said that the Prophet, peace be upon him, allowed a woman to sing. How come all these, and she used the unkind adjective, people, don't allow me to sing? What the blank is the idea that I come on Muslim radio and I talk about my CD, but I can't play the darn thing? Why is that a problem? Why am I not allowed to play my CD, not just talk about it? Because you said the Prophet would allow me to sing and do whatever I want. And I constantly find myself bringing it back to the reality of how we as a human society are oppressive to girls in every facet, in every dimension, before we're even allowed to speak. If a girl's energy is controlled, if her gait, if her posture, and I don't need to give you examples, how could we graduate to allowing her to talk first, allowing her to breathe without permission first? Then hopefully, inshallah, by God's grace, she can consider bringing up the fact that she would like to sing. So this is powerful. When a young woman came into the Prophet's quarters and she said, I made a vow to God, I wrote a song for you, that if God brought you back safe from your journey, I want to sing for you. And I can see the audience reacting now, and I can tell your ideological affiliations instantly, just before I even tell you the punchline. So anyway, but I'll forget all about it once I sit down. I won't remember. But anyways, so the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, fulfill your oath. And she sang for him. See, the issue here again, the image, the overemphasis on image and physical appearance, actually the emphasis on imagery in our culture has a very, very problematic issue. It makes us relinquish the freedom to choose. Literally, the image, because the image becomes within our psyche, it becomes imprinted. And I want to live up to a certain image, not to an ideal that I push myself constantly to be more vigilant, to be more dynamic, to be more humane, but I have this image that I must, and that image is a problem, because that image is the ultimate obstacle between me and making an intellectual and humane choice that elevates me and honors my celestial origin. So, again, I have 5 more minutes. Okay, great. So, by God's grace, in 5 minutes, what I'd like to do again is to really emphasize this notion of the sensual energy, the acknowledgement of sensual energy, is witnessed by 2 things in 2 Islamic injunctions. I know that's not how they're taught in the book, but we can dream. Number 1, menstruation. Menstruation is one of the most glorious affirmations of sensual energy anywhere. As a matter of fact, you're so precious, the Quran says, during your menstruation, as if the Quran is telling you, you know, girl, you're always engaged in prayer. Everything about you is prayer. That how God defines you is the vanguard of virtue and culture to such a point that when you are in that menstrual state, you're exempt from prayer. Even though your breathing is prayer. Wallahi, if we don't have time to, but I can prove it for you. You know, literally, the Quran and the Sunnah are telling a woman everything about you is prayerful and virtuous and righteous, and your job in society, as defined by God in the Quran, is you are the protector of the unseen. That's in Surah An-Nisa 34, Hafizatun lil-Ghaib. The protection of the unseen has nothing to do, and I know in the exegetical commentary we need serious help, because the protection of the unseen in almost all exegetical commentaries is the protection of the secrets of all men in society, of all men in the households. And of course, you all know we have all female households all over the world. What if we're all women inside a household? We can't fulfill our divine role until a man comes into our life? Rhetorical question, of course. But Anyway, so this is a realm of exegesis that still remains to be delved into. The other acknowledgement of sensual energy is remarkably the question of hijab. And incidentally, men do have to cover their head, but that's another lecture. And men do have to maintain a proper decorum in society by making sure they're covered. And you can switch hats or do whatever, you have a little more freedom, because your neck can show and all that, but your head ideally should be covered, and only your family should see your hair. The problem with the question of hijab is not that the Quran mandated it very clearly and unequivocally for women and men with the obvious differences. That's not the problem. The problem is hijab is seen as, rather than it being recognized for the celebration of feminine energy that it is, it's seen as, because you're in hijab, actually not because you're in hijab, you're a girl, therefore you must not talk, you must not breathe without permission, you must not leave the house, and by the way, another thing, when you become a woman, you have to cover, and nobody can see your nail. Otherwise, God knows what will happen to you. That's absurd. Because that's not from the Quran and it's not from the Sunnah. But it predates Islam, I promise you. Anthropologically, this idea of what a woman should do and where she belongs predates Islam and is so stubborn in the human psyche that men came and asked the Prophet and asked Imam Malik, even though there are 200 years between them, is it okay if I eat while my wife stands and serves me? And both the Prophet and Imam Malik said, God hates tyrants. This is the behavior of tyrants. But, incidentally, in certain parts of Western cultures, in non-Islamic world today, we still have this pathology, this cultural condition. In the 21st century, non-Islamic peoples have this pathology, have this cultural reality. So that's the problem with the hijab. Not the fact that it's ordained in the Quran and clearly elaborated upon the Sunnah. And if those among our daughters who choose not to cover, I'm not giving you ideas, by the way, but because only Allah, the coolest thing is that God is the ultimate judge. But the awesomest rebellion, and wallahi, I know this is recorded and all over the world and all that, but really, Allah is the ultimate judge. And many of our daughters do not cover, and they haven't hired me as an advocate or a spokesperson or nothing like that. But I'm telling you, it can be a form of rebellion, can be a form of, outside all the other issues, it can be the only lasting form of declaring their freedom from the cultural hegemony of those who call themselves Muslim. Whether it's valid or not, that's up to God, and they have to be embraced and accepted, because you do not leave Islam if you don't have your hijab on, even if it's mandated. And likewise for any other injunction in Islam. So we should recognize this. We should recognize the absurdity of how we have allowed the debasement of our social discourse on so many levels. And I know I've gone over my 5 minutes. I'll just pause here. I really had a wonderful example from the Quran. If anybody has specific or explicit questions, I'll be very happy to clarify them from the Quran and the Sunnah. But I think that just to let you know, the last portion was specifically, maybe it's not meant to be, but if it comes up in the questions, I'll happily address it. But literally, how talking about the physicality, the physical aspects of sexuality, and how the Quran addresses those, if that's helpful for later. Thank you all very much.
Thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time out to speak with us today. And now I would like to open the floor to any questions that anyone might have to get the discussion started.